Well, a few years ago, somebody was looking at chevrons along the coasts of East Africa, Northwest Australia, and Western India. And they detected a number of chevrons that all pointed back to a single point. Their thing was, it was in nearly 4 kilometres deep Indian Ocean. But fortunately, there was a survey ship nearby that was willing to take a look at this precise point. If there had been a meteor impact in the Mediterranean, then the best way of locating it would be examining the chevrons that might be found all around the Mediterranean. A number of chevrons have been found along the coast of Greece, Croatia, Italy, and in various parts of North Africa. What has been achieved is linking back the shape of these chevrons to a common point of origin. And that identified 2 huge impacts here off the island of Kefalonia. Hello folks, file number 7. This time we're going to look at the technique that's developed to pinpoint undersea impact craters.
So how good is the new method and how far back to the past will it go?
I think the new approach will be invaluable. We'll discuss it during this session, and I think it will work at least for the 20,000 years that cover the Younger Dryas. When a meteor impacts into ocean, it creates a pressure wave, which in fact induces the tsunami. At the point of impact, it produces the distinctive signature of the nanodiamonds, the carbon sphericals, etc. All of this gets swept up in the tsunami, so the sand and everything else, and bits of the meteor and these other things which we can track, date, form part of the wave of the tsunami. The tsunami spreads out in all directions. When it hits land, the seabed is rising, so the tsunami starts to slow, and when it gets relatively slow, it will deposit the detritus that it's carrying. Interestingly, it will deposit it in a very distinctive way in sort of crescent-shaped sand dunes that are referred to as chevrons. The interesting thing about this is that little half-moon shapes, but they show us the direction that the tsunami was travelling. So we look along a coastline, we see a series, we can identify a series of these chevrons. We can track back from the direction of travel to find a common point of origin. That's where the impact site was. Well, a few years ago, somebody was looking at chevrons along the coasts of East Africa, Northwest Australia, and Western India. And they detected a number of chevrons that all pointed back to a single point. Their thing was, it was in nearly 4 kilometres deep Indian Ocean. But fortunately, there was a survey ship nearby that was willing to take a look at this precise point. And they found a perfectly preserved impact crater. It's 25 kilometres wide, so not too small. And analysis of the isotopes from samples taken from these chevrons indicate the date of the impact between 3000 BC and 2800 BC, I say about 2900. What will be very interesting, looking at the geography, is whether that's the tsunami that was created, that delivered the chevrons, would also have funneled up the Persian Gulf and the Chateau l'Arabe, and could have devastated the ports of the Sumerian Empire along the Euphrates and the Tigris. But we haven't actually been looking for that information. We may have come across it, I don't know. But people who are familiar or in the future look at trying to decipher cuneiform tablets recovered from Iraq may well find instances that refer to this event. That would be quite interesting. There are estimated to be somewhere between 1 and 2 million of these cuneiform tablets. they can be a metre by half a metre, covered in script. It's estimated that less than 10% of these that have been dug out of the archaeological ruins have actually been translated. There are vast quantities that have not been touched that sit in the libraries in London, Berlin, and Yale University. So somebody has some free time, there's lots of interesting stuff to discover there. So having found this site in the Indian Ocean, which is referred to, if anyone wants to look at it, it's the Burkle impact, and it's named after one of the people on the team. With some speculation going on about this discovery that maybe the Ricat structure is the remains of Atlantis. More recently, I think about early 2024, there's the first published evidence that, based on speculation as to whether the Ricat structure did identify the location of Atlantis and whether the scouring that had exposed the bedrock had come out across the Sahara. If there had been a meteor impact in the Mediterranean, then the best way of locating it would be examining the chevrons that might be found all around the Mediterranean. Now, I initially thought this would be unlikely because of the extensive activities of mankind, all sorts of cultures, battles, cities being built and destroyed, etc., might wipe out the remains. But a number of chevrons have been found along the coast of Greece, Croatia, Italy, and in various parts of North Africa. As yet, we don't have the analysis of any samples, but what has been achieved is linking back the shape of these chevrons to a common point of origin. And that identified two huge impacts here off the island of Kefalonia. So the new technique is absolutely invaluable at identifying where meteors have impacted into sea. And the fact that we can identify the chevrons and get samples that we can date is a huge help. I think it's unlikely that this technique will work for meteors other than those in the last, say, up to 50,000 years, because of the amount of change that climate and other things will affect and age this evidence. But for the more recent past, it seems to be a fabulous technique. Give us great information.
Do we have evidence of the date of the impact?
Not yet. As I state in this book, whilst I think samples have been taken to analyse the contents of some of these chevrons, no one's published any dates as to when they think the impact took place. But what we do have, as we talked about last time, we have evidence that seawater reached this area around 10,000 BC. We don't have dating for when things may have ripped out the soil down to the bedrock around the Ricat structure, nor do we have dates as to when the Nile was flooded. But something reached here, and it doesn't happen every day. So if it wasn't the impact that ended the Younger Dryas period, it probably was an impact that affected one of the earlier Dryas periods. History's not been written on this yet, but the pieces are beginning to fall into place. Last year, I visited Malta. Malta is a little island south of Sicily, around here. So from this impact, it would have been devastated. And what astonished me when I visited Malta was the fact that the whole island almost is just bedrock. Something ravaged Malta, and from the topography you can tell that the biggest damage to the coastline is on the northeastern side, directly facing the impact, and the least damage on the southwest, where the island would have protected to some degree. Now, there's nowhere on Malta that's more than, say, 250 metres high. So if that impact created an 800-metre tsunami, it would have washed clean over the top at speed and ripped out everything, leaving just rock. And the surprising thing is, if you visit Malta, there is no soil there. Everywhere you walk, if it's not in the towns, is bedrock. There are no domesticated animals because there's no soil. Whilst I was there, we drove all over the island and saw 2 or 3 very small fields of market gardening. But basically everywhere we walked, bedrock with nothing but prickly pear cacti. So something really took off all the material all the ecosystem that had developed on Malta. Solon's description that he got from the priests at the Temple of Sais. Solon wrote that the capital, Atlantis, lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That's the Straits of Gibraltar, where Morocco and Spain nearly touch. If you went before the wind many leagues, the prevailing current of that area goes south, hugging the coast of West Africa. So you could say, if you allowed the ship just to continue forward, it would actually go along the coast of Africa. It's quoted as saying that the capital, Atlantis, comprised massive concentric docks with warehouses, factories and homes between circles of docks. The docks were approached from the south through a channel navigable from the sea. We have evidence that Tamanrasset was a major river. It flowed out through a wide estuary, and an enormous amount of soil and other spoil that had been washed down by the river had accumulated offshore into the Atlantic. 300 kilometres long spoil from the river estuary. The city was graced with beautiful gardens and hot springs. Yes, there are plenty of hot springs still in the area. Either side of the city were wide, fertile plains. Yes, 12,000 years ago, the Tamanrasset River Basin was a fertile tropical area, and in the far distance to the north were high mountains. Yes, one can see the Atlas Mountains to the north. Solon also noted that the first king of Atlantis was called Atlas. Now, there seems to be a surprising amount of specificity in Solon's description. There's also other evidence which is more speculative, but does point to the evidence of a seaborne trading culture dating very far back. These may sound a bit random, but they call for some sort of explanation. In quite deep water off Donana, which is near Cadiz in southwestern Spain, which is here, you will find Cadiz. They found a large number of stone anchors, very large stone anchors, in relatively close proximity that points to that being a harbour. Problem is, now it's in quite deep water. Now maybe it was a harbour before the sea level rose. Quite interesting. People have judged that the anchors were far too large for the Phoenicians to have used on their pretty small ships. And the Phoenicians were very plucky, and they did sail out into the Atlantic as far back as 1500 BC, but we're talking nearly 10,000 BC here. In fact, referring to Cadiz, Cadiz was founded by the Phoenicians in 1100 BC. There's also a large number of enigmatic ancient stone constructions found all over the islands of the Azores, which are out in the Atlantic to the west of Cadiz. And finally, we have 2 ancient maps which show the word Atlantis written more or less where I've written the Tamanrasset River Basin. One is attributed to Herodotus, produced about 450 BC, and Herodotus is one of the two biggest authors who quote Solon. So that may be where he got the idea from. The other is to a Roman cartographer, Mela, in a map dated AD 43. So at that point, Solon's writings may still have been available in the original. We don't know. To conclude on that, today we have evidence of a huge meteor crater. We have the chevrons dotting around the coast. We have the ability to gather evidence and date them. We're just waiting for the results.
So it seems the fable of Atlantis is actually based on an actual event. Are there any other myths that are also based on actual events?
Yes, historians have documented around 500 different tribal myths that describe events both in North America and around the world that reflect circumstances of sharply rising sea levels, of fire and death wrought upon the earth by a vengeful god for misdeeds that they've done. Most North American peoples have an oral tradition about their history telling of a time of great destruction when the gods threw down fireballs and burned the forests and the animals, a terrible flooding, deadly hailstones, and darkness for months or years. Pretty much exactly what we know a big meteor impact will cause. In a book called The History of the Dakotas, written by James Lind and published in 1863, he reports such tribal histories from 15 different tribes based all over North America, from Alaska to California, from Quebec to Massachusetts. Interestingly, another data point which is really good, it shows the ability of ancient peoples to record historical events by retelling orally a story to enable those events to be remembered over incredible periods of time. Two examples are reported in The Economist news magazine in their edition from 27th of February 2020. Give some strong proof of this. Firstly, the Klamath of Oregon in the US. The Klamath tell of a god that lived in a mountain and fell in love with a village girl, as you would. Unfortunately, the girl rebuffed his advances, and Lao, an underworld god, emerged and cascaded fire and brimstone down the mountain onto her village. But a sky god, Skell, acted to protect the villagers and forced Lao back into his mountain, and then destroyed his home, quenching the fire of Lao by filling his home with water. Today, the site is known as Crater Lake. In the midst of a dormant volcano, Mount Mazuma, which we referred to in a previous episode, geological evidence shows that the last eruption of Mazuma took place 5,700 BC, thereabouts. So the tribe have memorialized that eruption that took place over 8,000 years ago in a story which is slightly developed to give it human features, but essentially is saying exactly what happened 8,000 years ago. The tribe have captured the essence of that and have maintained its memory. So, bear with me, the second example is even more extreme. The Gudjimara of Victoria State in Australia, they maintain another oral tradition about a lake in an extinct volcano. Evidence published by Dr. Machin of Melbourne University in Geology magazine indicates how incredibly old this tradition is. The story concerns an individual whose name is now preserved as the name of the mountain, Bujbin. It's 300 kilometres due west of Melbourne. The tradition tells of the land and trees dancing as beings came to life deep below the ground, with Bujbin spitting liquid fire from his mouth. Whilst this volcano was known to be relatively young in geological terms, Dr. Machin resolved to date the last eruption. The results are astounding. Argon dating, which is good for this sort of period, measuring the gradual decay of a radioactive isotope of potassium, dates the last eruption to 35,000 BC. The date of a defining event that has been immortalized. So, when we talk about things that only happened 10,000 years ago, it's instructive, I think, to study the myths and stories that have been handed down. They're not literal facts, but they do embody facts that the people of that time experienced. And I think it's a great learning for us.
So if you know these stories and you're the leader of the communities, what do you do? What's your plan?
Dig. With many communities recounting detailed oral accounts of terror coming from the skies, I think any good leader would propose dig. This is something we can consider in a future episode. Thank you.
Thank you.